Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Anglo Election Insights, where it's now been about 3 days since the Tasmanian election, and it's time to have a little talk about what has happened and reflect on my own coverage of the election and talk a little bit about where to from here. So, here is the Poll Bludgers results page. You can see that the Liberals have clearly won the most vote, and if we have a look at the ABC, they've also clearly won the most seats with 14 seats and a potential for an extra 2 if things go well for them in the late count, but we'll talk more about where things sit exactly later on. I'll let you guys go through and view the different MPs that are likely to get up and what exactly has happened in each seat yourself, but it appears that the gains have been pretty much across the board for the Liberals, perhaps a little bit softer in certain places like areas of Launceston where the swing wasn't particularly great, and then the swing was particularly big in areas like Braddon and Lyons, the more kind of rural spots, whereas perhaps not quite as big in places like Launceston and Hobart, as I said. But across the board, the Liberals have done quite well with a 3% swing to Labor. They've been deserted, 3% swing against, and it appears that they're on track for their worst primary vote in Tasmania for over 100 years. The Greens, their top line result doesn't look particularly impressive, but when you factor in Peter George taking a big chunk of their vote in Franklin, that is actually quite an impressive result for the Greens. Nationals flopped, Shooters, Fishers and Farmers did better than expected, and the 4 main independents who were favoured to take seats have done so, all of them relatively comfortably as well. If you want to follow the post count more closely, I would suggest Kevin Bonham, as I've been doing. Okay, so time to evaluate how I did in terms of my coverage. My final prediction more or less looked like this. I had the Nats winning a seat in Lyons. It looks as if Shooters, Fishers and Farmers will win that seat instead. I don't think that was particularly on anyone's bingo card, but that's what's happened. One of the slightly more controversial aspects of my prediction was that the Liberals would win a 4th seat in Braddon, and I'm pleased to see that that is in fact what's happened. I thought Labor might be a little bit more competitive in Lyons, but as it turns out, the Liberals gained 3 quotas on primary vote alone. And then in Franklin, I thought that the second Labor seat might be under slight threat from the Liberals, and I noticed that the ABC still hasn't called that final seat. It does appear that Labor will win it, but I did sort of correctly identify that the Liberals were a chance to hang on to 3, and it would be at Labor's expense if they did. And Clark, well, that was pretty clear cut. The Greens, in the end, were the party that polled under 2 quotas, but they will comfortably hold that seat in the end. And then Bass, I think in that rushed video just before the election, this final square, I just gave it to like a generic independent, but really, I should have been more clear. What I meant was that I had no idea what was going to happen in this seat, this 7th seat in Bass. And 3 days after the election, and we still don't really know what's going to happen to it. There are at least 4 or 5 parties / candidates who are potentially in the hunt here. So I think it was reasonable to say that we weren't really sure what was going to happen. So on the whole, looks like my predictions more or less bore out pretty well. And currently, as I said, the Liberals are certain to win 14 seats, in with a slight chance of 16, but more realistically, 15 could be their best number potentially. Labor, they have a chance to win that final seat in Bass, but ultimately they're likely to end up on 10. The Greens will be on 5. They are a slight chance in Bass as well. Independents, the 4 that we expected would win, they have comfortably won. And then, to everyone's surprise, Shooters, Fishers and Farmers potentially in the running for 2 seats, most likely 1, but there is a chance that they don't win either of those. So where to from here? There are 2 scenarios, a Liberal or a Labor government. So the less likely option would be the Labor government, and it appears that Rockcliffe is going to have first crack at forming government himself and finding confidence on the floor. Although I think even if Labor are sort of making calls and trying to get some of the crossbenchers, particularly the independents, on side behind the scenes, I'm not so sure that some of these crossbenchers are going to be wanting to die on the hill of supporting a Labor government over a Liberal government, given the swings on primary vote, the pretty clear message that Tasmanians sent in that regard. They would certainly be blamed for supporting a Labor government if that was seen to be against the will of the Tasmanian people. And I think with primary votes of about 24% and 40%, it would be pretty hard to justify supporting a Labor government in that sense, I think. And yeah, that would be a big political risk both to Labor and the crossbenchers who, the crossbenchers would basically cop the blame for supporting a Labor government, and Labor themselves would be seen as quite cynical. And, I think it's one of those situations where, they could form government and struggle through a term, but then they would potentially be kicked out of office quite substantially at the next election and find themselves in the wilderness again for another decade. The only thing as a caveat to that is Dean Winter himself. His leadership is very much at stake here. If he can't form government, I really don't think he can stay on as leader. So he has a particular motivation there to form government if possible. As for a Liberal government, Rockcliffe is likely to have 14 of his own MPs and then up to 2 allies or potential allies with Shooters, Fisher, Farmers. They're not necessarily like partisan Liberal Labor type MPs, and they might not be so quick to support Rockcliffe, but they're definitely closer to, or they're definitely his closest allies on the crossbench compared to some of the other independents, I would argue. I think if he managed to get the support of 16, then it would be very risky for the remaining crossbench independents to want to go and support Labor. And then in the lead up to the election, a lot of those independents, Christy Johnson, Craig Garland particularly, come to mind. They didn't really give the indication that they wanted to enter into formal agreements, but they also didn't indicate that they were particularly partisan about who they wanted to form government. And I think overall here, Rockcliffe has basically just cemented himself as a pretty popular leader, pretty popular figure within Tasmania. Somewhat polarising, I would argue, but certainly more popular than anyone on the other side of the aisle. And the Liberals managed to claim that middle ground that Dutton very much ceded at the federal level. So federal Labor and state Liberals seem to have a stranglehold on the centre of Tasmania's voting bloc. If we have a look at how the polling went, YouGov, their final poll was quite inaccurate. It had Labor's support basically neck and neck with the Liberals at 30 and 31, which was a vast underestimation of the Liberals and a significant overestimation of Labor. And that was a bit of a surprise, having been quite accurate in the federal election. What I'm suspecting is that by waiting for the recall vote at the federal election, that possibly poisoned their sample, because I think potentially a lot of lower information voters in regional Tasmania who would have switched their vote from Liberal to Labor for the federal election, maybe they're not the kind of people that were taking these polls, and the sample that YouGov ended up with via their weighting could have included too many respondents who are not swing voters but actually just solid Labor voters. That's my theory on how that happened, but yeah, YouGov themselves actually bragged about how they were the only polling company who were waiting for federal election recall vote, and I think that might actually be what undid them. Demos AU, they correctly identified the Liberals' lead, so I think their final poll had the Liberals up by like 9 or 10%, which undershot them a little bit, but given the high vote for others and independents, we sort of expected that there would probably, well, I expected at least that the majors would poll slightly better than what the polling was showing. And they also showed a high Green and a high Independent vote, which absolutely bore out. And then finally, EMRS, they were commissioned by the Liberals for those tracking waves, and a lot of people wrote those off as just like propaganda push polls, and even I was a little bit suspicious that maybe those polls were designed to push a bit of a narrative, but in the end they were the most accurate. Their final poll had the Liberals on 37% of the vote, which is the highest of any pollster this election, and the Liberals ultimately polled about 40%. Generally, the polls did overstate independents a little bit, which we expected, and shooters, fishers and farmers were a little bit understated, usually polling below the Nats, which, as we know, on election night it ended up the other way around. So the overall upshot for me, as I mentioned in the Forever Government video, the Liberals remain Tasmanian's sort of natural state government. They don't have competition on the centre-right particularly, they have moderate leadership, and what was most interesting on the live stream on election night with Heath from Thought Digest Media joining us, he was explaining that they seem to have a more sort of cozy and powerful relationship with the media, and their social media presence and their sort of propaganda unit, if you like, is a lot stronger. Their party structure appears to be a lot stronger than Labor's in Tasmania, and they, from the outset of this election, I think they really grabbed hold of the narrative, and yeah, they really had that structure to be able to do that, whereas Labor weren't really able to define themselves and the reason for the election in a way that was really powerful enough to grab the attention of voters. I think, yeah, it really demonstrated that the Liberals are the big boys in town in Tasmania, and that doesn't appear to be changing anytime soon. Labor also just can't find enough electoral ground. They can't find enough space on the ideological spectrum in state politics to be able to work with. There was obviously a large amount of Tasmanian voters who they either hated the stadium, they're becoming more and more progressive, and they are interested more in environmental conservation as opposed to protecting primary industry. And Labor basically couldn't tap into any of those groups. And I think that was the frustration. Like Sormon on the live stream was basically looking and saying, well, you know, what's the problem here? Why can't Labor move to the left and work with these groups that the more progressive voters in Tasmania desperately want them to do? And it demonstrates the trouble that Labor are going to have going forward in a state where you have these more genuine conflicts between conservationists and the more progressive city voters versus the more rural and regional voters who have genuine concerns about the future of primary industry. And I did find it really interesting how the narrative around Labor and the Greens was sort of totally flipped from the federal election, whereas in the federal, the Greens were blamed for not working effectively with the Labor government, whereas in this election, Labor were blamed for not having a good working relationship with the Greens and giving themselves no pathway to power. The Greens and the Independents, they obviously have a lot of space to move to Labor's left, and basically if Tasmanian Labor want to move into that space, they'll be doing it against the wishes of their federal counterparts in terms of whether it be the stadium or taking a more ardent approach against primary industry, that sort of thing. Albanese worked really hard to secure that sort of blue collar vote, and I think the influence of the federal government was quite strong on this election. Although it's not without precedent that state Labor could move further to the left. Here in Victoria, for example, Dean Winter actually explicitly mentioned the native logging ban that we have, and he pointed to it as a policy failure, which is interesting. And then lastly, shooters, fishers and farmers, they kind of rose up and unexpectedly took probably what was some of those voters who had previously supported Jackie Lamy, and whether or not that's something that continues throughout future election cycles, if that's something they can build on now with potentially one, even two MPs in the parliament, that could be interesting to watch. Alright, well, thanks everybody for watching this video. Thanks for following the coverage. I'll be out with more videos shortly on the state of state politics in a few other states. I've got a big video on Queensland coming up this week, so sit tight, keep watching the content. If you're enjoying it, please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll catch you in the next video.